Hey, how's it going everybody? This is Craig Peters here from Soundiron, and in today's tips and tricks, I'm going to be showing you guys how I use reverb to create a little bit more of a realistic space for my orchestral tracks. And you can use this with any other reverb that you have. The reverb that I'm going to be showing you guys today is called Cinematic Rooms from LiquidSonics. I use their Seventh Heaven a lot, and I really wanted to check out Cinematic Rooms and see how it fits a little bit and see some of the things that I can do. So some of the things we're going to cover in this video is routing, how I go about routing my different sections to my reverb using effects tracks, some pre-fader effects that you can use, and just for sort of creating a little bit more distance with the orchestral sections, as well as taking some more samples that have a lot of hall baked into it and giving them a little bit more of a drier, tighter sound to get an overall consistent reverb sound without having too many different halls kind of bleeding together. So let's go ahead and start checking it out. So this track was for a Soundiron session that I did a while back in the style of Danny Elfman. If you want to see a little bit more of my approach to how I wrote this track, you can check it out up here. So I'm going to go ahead and play a little section, and then I'm going to stop it, and you're going to be able to hear how dry this overall mix is right now. So you can see when I stop it, there's no real reverb. Like if anything, there's maybe like a hair of a little bit of a room sound at the end. But really nothing. I try to get it as dry as possible. So for the strings, what I'm using is our Hyperion Strings elements. All of the reverb that comes within the UI is turned off, so it's just super dry. So if you want to hear how that sounds. It's completely dry. And the benefit of having this really dry sound is that you have the option of blending with other string libraries. So if you have one that has a little bit more room baked into it and you want a little bit more attack, you can go ahead and use something like this. And you can also position it anywhere you want. I have this in a little bit more of a traditional violin one position. So having this really dry sound is great. So if you want, you can also use the reverb that comes with the library. There's different halls and options to choose from. But let's say if you want to just use this. So you hear it now, it sounds a little bit more like in a hall type sound. But for this, I'm going to be using it just completely dry because I want to use my own external reverb to route everything to. So one of the other things I want to talk about is when you have libraries that are really wet sounding. So let's go ahead and find a section that is a little bit more faster, you know, a little bit more stuff going on. So you can see, and this is the Symphony Series brass that we did with Native Instruments. So let's go ahead and play this. See how, you know, you can still hear a little bit of hall like while it's playing, but the tail, like when you stop everything, it's, you know, a lot drier than it normally would be. So this is how it sounds with the release all the way up normal. See how there's that tail that's kind of baked in there? So what I like to do if I want to take something like this that has that baked in, you can use the release, shorten it down. For this, I found around 30% got that sound that I wanted. So that helps. And then I just did that for all of my woodwinds and all of the brass, just so I have a consistent dry sound that's similar to the strings. So the reverb that we're going to be using is from LiquidSonics. This is called Cinematic Rooms. It's a fairly new reverb that they came out with. And it's a really great sounding reverb. There's some really cool features in it, a few that I found really useful as far as for mixing purposes. So what I did is I went and I loaded up just a large hall. And right now you're not going to hear anything because I don't have any of the different sends turned on. All right, so pretty much the way I go about doing it is you have your different group tracks. So you have strings, brass, woodwinds. So if, let's say, I just want to hear all the brass. Or I have my strings. And this goes for everything. And then I have all these different group tracks routed to sort of like a master orchestral group. And that's this right here. And I just have a few Slate plugins just for mixing purposes. And then what I'll do is I'll take this effects track and I'll load my reverb plugin into there, which is going to be Cinematic Rooms. And then what I'll do is I'll have these different sends that are going to be routed to this effects track. And the good thing about this is that if, let's say, you want a little bit more reverb on certain sections, it's really easy. Then you just control that amount using the send. And for the wet mix, I'm always going to keep it at 100, just so that way, whenever I'm feeding my sends to it, you're getting the full amount of reverb. If I was to use this on maybe an individual track, like load this on the actual track, I would maybe adjust the wetness depending on how much I wanted it in the signal. Let's go ahead and listen to strings, and then I'm just gonna gradually turn up the send volume so you can hear when the actual reverb is starting to kick in. So now you hear there's a little bit of that hull in there. So now we can go ahead and play it, turn it on, turn it off. So that sounds good. And one of the things I like about this reverb, it almost kind of has a little bit of that Haas effect. I feel like it kind of, once you enable it and turn it on, it almost kind of pushes it back a little bit into the sound spectrum. I feel like with it off, it's a little bit more upfront, really dry, and then when I turn it on, it kind of pushes it back a little bit. It makes it almost like it places it in the space, which is cool. And if you already have everything panned how you want, then everything should sit fine. So now let's go ahead and turn on our brass and then adjust it. And with some of the different sections, depending on if you're thinking about them sitting in the room, you'll have the strings here, and then brass and woodwinds, and then percussion, or depending on wherever they're placed. So I always try to think of like the further more back they are into the room, the closer they are to the walls, so you're going to get a little bit more reverberation. Since strings are a little bit more up front, I would think they would sound a little bit more dry, but still hearing that tail after the fact. So then let's go ahead and do our woodwinds. So I'm kind of putting them a little bit sort of in the same level send-wise as the brass, since it's kind of in a similar area. So let's go ahead and listen to these three now. So you hear it all kind of die together. And then after that, we have our choir. So talking about some of the pre-fader stuff that I was mentioning earlier, one of the things that you can do is you can play around with the pre-fader settings, and then you can actually lower the fader, and it'll keep the reverb amount, but it'll just lower the actual source. So let's take the choir. So you see, let me go ahead and turn my automation off. So when you have it set to post fader, pretty much when you turn the volume down, everything on that track, the volume is going to go down. When you have it pre-fader, which if you want to turn that on, you just click this little button right here and it turns blue. So now, so you can hear by lowering that volume, it almost kind of makes the choir a little bit more distant, and usually choirs are always in the very back. And with this, or at least for this track, that's the way I'm thinking about the actual seating arrangement. So when you do it this way, it actually gives it that little bit more of that Haas effect where it kind of pushes it back a little bit. So now let's hear everything in context. So that sounds cool. Now let's go ahead and listen to the percussion. So you can hear it's super dry. So you can hear that percussion is super dry, and the percussion that we're going to be using, or that we are using, is from Apocalypse Percussion Elements. So similar to what I did with Symphony Series Brass and Woodwinds, this has a little bit of that room kind of baked into it as well. So this is how it sounds normal. So what I wanted to do was dry it up a little bit and make it similar to everything else. So I just went and brought this back to around 40. So you can hear it definitely dries it up by taking that release down. So now let's go back into our mixer, and then we're going to go ahead and now feed some of this percussion into the reverb too. Cool, now let's hear everything in context. So here now there's that sort of nice fading hall sound in the overall track. And then one of the things that you can do, normally there's a few ways you can do this. So now this is a little bit more of a mixing thing when it comes to orchestral reverb, is sometimes you have this really bright sound when it comes to the reverb tail, and maybe you don't want that. So there's a few things you can do. So you can actually put you could put an EQ after it and just filter out. You know, you could do a little bit of a low pass just to get some of that high end sort of sizzle from the reverb. You hear that difference? It's a pretty big difference actually. So, and some of that can actually maybe get in the way of the mix, or maybe just be, you know, a little bit of a sound you don't want. So I like to kind of filter out some of those highs. And you can also do a low pass as well. Maybe dial that back a little bit. Now let's go ahead and A/B the whole thing. So it's one of those things, it's like that sort of like 2 or 3% thing that most people might not really notice, but it's something that you can do as sort of a mix thing for just clearing up the mix a little bit more and taking out some stuff you don't really need, some of that kind of low rumbly stuff and some of that kind of high sizzly stuff that you might hear in the reverb. But in Cinematic Rooms, one of the cool things that you can do too is there's this treble contour, and you can actually adjust that right here. So you hear when I boost it, it gets really bright. So it just kind of takes a little bit some of those really high sounds that you get in the reverb out. So it's just a few different ways that you can go about doing it. The EQ thing is cool because you have a little bit more control, but this is a nice little feature that's on here. And then there's a bunch of different halls. You know, from there, let's say you're like, okay, I like how this sounds. Maybe I want to play around with it. Some of the things that you can do too is playing around with the reverb time. If let's say maybe 3 seconds is a lot. Maybe you want to go around 2. And if you look down here in the reflection and reverb levels, you can see how the actual tail is dying off. Or maybe you want to increase it. So I mean, around, I would say anywhere between 2 and 3 seconds, depending on what you're doing. Then from there, you can cycle through some of the different sounds. Let's say maybe you want to try a different hall. So you can see these are a little bit more smaller halls. So you got chambers and ambiances. Let's say you're wanting to try something different. Let's see, let's try this silver chamber. So some of them are a little bit more subtle, and you can kind of craft them a little bit more even after the fact. I like this this large hull. I usually use a large hull similar to this in the Seventh Heaven plugin from LiquidSonics, but yeah, this is just a few things that I like to do as far as creating a more realistic orchestral hull sound using some reverb and some of the different ways that I go about approaching it. Alright, so that about wraps it up for this video. If you guys have any of your own reverb tricks and things that you guys like to do, definitely drop them in the comments. If you found this video helpful, definitely give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell if you haven't already. I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Take care.